going to jump into the Word, and I'm in an accidental series at this point. You're with me, so welcome. We're in an accidental series. So 2 weeks ago, I felt like we were supposed to go into the idea of the whisper of the Lord, and listening for His whisper. And kind of the backdrop, the highlight scripture we used was from 1 Kings chapter 19. And we talked about how the prophet Elijah was in this situation where he just had this massive success, this massive victory against the prophets of Baal and the ruling powers of Israel that were worshipers of Baal. And he just kind of had this massive victory against them and wiped out all of the prophets of Baal and really turned the tide of how things were going in his nation during that time for the people of God. And now the queen Jezebel, who was a Baal worshiper, had sent out the kill order for him. So basically he's now a marked man. Everybody's after him. So he runs, he flees, he's on the mountain, he's on Mount Sinai for 40 days, and or he runs for 40 days and ends up on Mount Sinai, and he's complaining to God about his situation, how he's the only one left and everything's gone wrong. And then there's the windstorm and the fire and the earthquake, and all these bombastic, cataclysmic things are happening. And the Lord tells him that he's going to pass by the mountain. And as he passes by, there's all these huge kind of groundbreaking things, earth-shaking things happening. And it specifically says, but God was not in those things. And then after the three big bombastic things, the earthquake, the fire, the windstorm, you end up with this gentle whisper. And Elijah hears that gentle whisper and knows it's the voice of the Lord. And then he goes and says the exact same set of complaints to God afterwards. No change, no adjustment, no progress made on his part. He stays exactly where he was before the voice, before the Lord's presence passed by him, and continues his kind of complaints. And then God proceeds to tell him that, by the way, your next move is going to be to raise up your successor, appoint your successor, Elisha. So the point of that first week was, number one, the idea that God's voice, more often than not, ends up being received by us in the form of like a whisper-like communication. Doesn't mean he can't speak audibly, but that's rare. Doesn't mean he can't use the bombastic, cataclysmic things, but in the example from 1 Kings 19, it was actually quite the contrary, intentionally the opposite of those things. More often for us as believers and followers of Christ, it's a whisper-like communication. And we were even talking about how, perhaps different than the prophet Elijah, you and I have the Holy Spirit married in union with our spirit. We're one with Him in spirit, is how 1 Corinthians chapter 6 describes it. If you've united yourself with the Lord, don't you realize that you're one with Him in spirit? And so that whisper for us oftentimes, and I would say most of the time, almost all of the time, that whisper comes from within, because that's where He abides. He resides within you. He's made Himself one with you spiritually. And so that whisper is something that you actually discern, and it's part of your inner being. And that there's a process of discerning, just like you have to listen for when somebody's trying to whisper something in your ear. And we talked about the telephone game, the game of telephone. And when you play that game, especially with kids, things get pretty wild. I've had some pretty wild telephone games. I don't know about you. But things will mutate and transform very quickly if you don't have very intentional listeners to the whisper, intentional listeners of the whisper. And so we talked a lot about that. I won't go through every nuance in detail. Last week, we ended up talking about Samuel. And in 1 Samuel chapter 3, Samuel's just a boy, and we don't know exactly how old he is. We know he's weaned, and he's been handed over to Eli and the priest class in Shiloh, which is the region that they were in. And there's this boy, Samuel, who's serving almost as like a protege or like an understudy to these priests. And Samuel goes to bed, and he's sleeping, or he's trying to sleep. I guess he doesn't actually fall asleep, but he's looking to sleep next to the tent of meeting, next to the tabernacle. This is the place where the ark of God, the ark of the covenant, would be housed in. And if you know your Old Testament kind of history, that ark was the premier and principal location in which the presence of God manifested. The ark was the central location, the centerpiece of where the manifestation of God's presence would occur. And the ark ended up becoming this valuable asset for the people of God, for the Israelites. And when they lost the ark because of, idolatry and other things, when they went wayward, they were losing more than just a box that had religious significance. They were losing. It was like they were losing the very glory of God in their midst. They were losing the presence of God in their midst. So you got Samuel, a boy who's sleeping near the ark, and in the middle of the night, he hears his voice being called Samuel, and he goes to Eli, his kind of surrogate father, his priestly overseer, and he's like, "What is it?" He's like, "I didn't call you. Go back to bed." This happens 3 times. Finally, Eli says, "If this happens again, Samuel, it's the Lord. It's got to be the Lord speaking. So instead of coming to me, say, 'Speak now, Lord, for your servant is listening.'" And so anyways, Samuel does that the 4th time and gets his first prophetic word, his first time he's ever intentionally and knowingly heard God's voice. And it ends up being terrible news for Eli. So bummer for Samuel, because now he has to be the bearer of bad news for his dad, his surrogate dad. What we talked about there, and again, I'm not going to go through the whole teaching. These messages are online if you're interested in getting them later. So since we've been in this kind of accidental series, but what we talked about is a couple things. Number one, they were in Shiloh, which in Hebrew means place of rest. The location they were residing in was called the place of rest, Shiloh. The time of day that God first spoke to Samuel was in the evening while they were resting, at rest. The place where he spoke was when Samuel was lying down as close to the ark, as close to the tabernacle, as close to the manifest presence of God as possible. And I've got to do a little bit of cleanup here so you don't think the wrong things. You don't have an ark. I don't have an ark. This church building is not the ark or the temple or any of those things. Don't misconstrue the symbolism. The idea here is Samuel was posturing himself toward the presence of God. There was an intentionality in his heart posture toward the presence. For them, it was a physical outward thing. Like there's literally this physical box that I can lean towards, I can lay towards. For us, his presence, again, is where? Already within you. His presence is everywhere. Wherever you go, he's with you. Jesus would say things, if 2 or 3 of you gather in my name, there I am. Paul would tell you, don't you know? Because this is obvious, apparently. Don't you know that you yourselves are the temple of the Holy Spirit? Didn't you realize that you are the tabernacle? You are the tent. You, in some sense, are a carrier of that ark. You're what houses that presence. You, your body, your person, you. And so it's not that you're coming and going in and out of his presence, but what your heart may be doing, and I'm sure is doing on some level, is your heart may be leaning towards that presence with intentionality, or perhaps relegating itself to some default kind of neutral state or even wayward state where you're no longer posturing yourself toward him. And so you might be asking yourself, well, what does that mean? How do I posture myself towards God? How do I lean towards his presence? And the answer is what it comes down to is reverence and consciousness of him. Worship is one of the greatest means. Worship is one of the greatest vehicles, because what is worship? Worship is the moment that you begin to behold him in awe. When you begin to see him, not with your physical eyes, but with your heart's eyes. When you begin to behold him and begin to adore and appreciate, and with gratitude in your heart, praise and honor, and that's a state of worship. So what's happening? Well, in your heart, you're leaning towards his presence. Even in conversation, if you're talking to other believers especially, you can intentionally be honing in and looking for the heart of God, the presence of God in the conversation. I've had many times where I've freshly heard God's voice, not because I was in the prayer closet for 2 hours, not because I spent a ton of time praying in tongues or fasting or doing any of the normal spiritual things you might think, but because I was listening with an openness in my heart, even to conversations. And God just pops right up, whispers something in my ear, and I'm not willy-nilly about it. That might be the springboard for me. That might be the trigger point where now I'm discerning, like, I think that might have been something God was saying. Let me explore that. Let me go into some sort of kind of intentional discovery mode with him and begin to ask him some questions and seek him out and pursue that thought. And more often than not, once I'm kind of in that zone, it turns out, yeah, he really is saying something, and I just had to chase it down a little bit. Now, Samuel was in a place of rest, leaning towards the presence of God. I'm not saying that God only speaks when you're at rest, but I am saying there is an advantage. There's an advantage to being in a place of rest. And rest doesn't mean that your situation is perfect and every circumstance around you is at peace and there's no problems and quite the contrary. There's plenty of problems present in Samuel's day. And in fact, the whole priestly occupation was wrought with problems. Eli's sons were backstabbers, and they were idolaters, and they were problematic in every which way. They were wicked to the core. And Eli was old and failing and half blind and overweight and immobile. And Eli was not really able to do much for Samuel. So Samuel had plenty of challenges. The idea of rest is not the lack of challenges being present. It's actually the state of your heart in spite of those things. It's a place, and again, rest is a consciousness thing. It's a posturing thing. It's not trying to set up your situation perfectly just so and calling that rest. It's a heart matter. And what does rest ultimately boil down to? Trust. How come Jesus was asleep on the boat during the storm when the professional fishermen were bugging out, losing their minds, ready to I don't know, they thought they were going to die. So in the natural, the most equipped people and the most qualified people were freaking out. The least qualified person in the natural for this job is sleeping on a cushion in the stern. Which one of them brought the victory? Which one of them was at rest? Which one of them was doing God's will proper? And it's obvious. It's obvious. And I've even heard it pointed out that the point of the storm wasn't so that Jesus could show us our ability, or show us his ability, rather, to calm the storm with a word. That's cool, and that's good to know that he can do that, and he could do it through people. The point of the storm was actually to show us what it looks like to rest in spite of the storm. When they woke Jesus up, Jesus didn't say, "Thank goodness you woke me up. Now I can do a miracle and help you." He actually said, "Where's your faith? Why are you so afraid? Why aren't you resting?" You could almost reconfigure what he said into a statement like that. Why are you not in the same state that I'm in? We wouldn't have even had to calm the storm if we all stayed at a place of rest, because we would have just ridden this thing out. We already knew that God said we're going to the other side. So the state of rest is not changing the circumstance necessarily. The state of rest is knowing that God has it no matter what, in spite of the circumstance as it's playing out. Okay, we talked about how Samuel had to give a very uncomfortable word. His first word took him outside of his comfort zone. He has to tell his dad, by the way, the first word I ever heard from God, and you helped me hear it, by the way, is one that makes me incredibly uncomfortable because it's about you in a negative way. And God, so let me again do some cleanup. Your job, hearing God's voice, is never to tear down someone else. In New Testament prophecy, there's 3 purposes. Ready? Comfort, encouragement, and strengthening. Let me say those again. Comfort, encouragement, and strengthening. I'm going to just say it again. Comfort, encouraging, and strengthening. Your job is not to correct everyone around you because you've heard from God. That's a good way of knowing that you didn't hear correctly. And whatever you did hear was either not from God at all or got so twisted and distorted along the way by your own stuff that it's lost in translation. You played telephone with a bunch of children and lost. That's what happens when New Testament prophecy goes amiss. We talked about how nobody actually taught Samuel how to hear God's voice. This is maybe the most important thing I've said so far. So if you've been ignoring me because you're like, I was here the last 2, or I don't care, I want to hear what you have to say today, or I just don't want to be here, I'm at church, but I'm just trying to wait until the hot. If you're in any of those categories, please just listen to this one part, and this will help you. Nobody taught Samuel how to hear God's voice. It was an inherent, innate capability. It's as though, just as a child is not, a healthy child with 5 senses, 5 physical senses, nobody teaches a child how to hear, how to taste, how to see. These are God-given, built-in faculties, part of your design, part of the design of your body. Spiritually, the same is true of your ability to hear God's voice. You're already hearing his voice. Samuel was already hearing God's voice. What he was learning was sensitivity and discernment. He was learning how to identify, this is God's voice. I'm already hearing it. That's not the problem. Knowing that I'm hearing it and being sensitive towards it, that's where the progression and development goes. And just like a child, you might have to tell them, yep, that what you're feeling right now when you bite into that candy bar, that's sweet. Those pretzels are, they might need language and they might need some sensitivity building instruction, but they already know how to taste. They already know how to hear. They already know how to do all of those things. Similarly, Jesus said, my sheep know my voice. They know my voice. John chapter 10, they know my voice. You know his voice. If you're his sheep, you know his voice. You might need to work on sensitivity and discernment. Let me say it again, in fact. You do need to work. I need to work. We all need to work on sensitivity and discernment. Samuel had to work on sensitivity and discernment. Okay. Big review. It's an accidental series, so whatever. This is how it's going. Today, we're going to be talking about David. So, 1 Samuel chapter 23. Quick background. David is on the run. King Saul knows that David has prophetically been anointed to succeed him. Saul knows that his days as king are numbered, that the dynasty, the family dynasty that he dreamt of and thought was a sure thing, hey, my son Jonathan will surely be the next king, and then after that, his son will be the king. Saul sees that whole dynasty thought being challenged by David's presence. And he's thinking the wrong thoughts, and he has the wrong idea, and the whole thing, he might be right about part of it, but his whole thought process is dead wrong. But anyway, Saul's response to this situation is, well, I'll just kill David. Problem solved. Then we can keep going, as if that was going to work out for him. So that was his plan. So now David's on the run. David ends up first all by himself. He ends up going from being like a military commander of, where he's got the armies of Israel at his beck and call. He goes from being one of the most powerful people in the nation to being a refugee, a fugitive, and he ends up kind of in the middle of nowhere in this town full of priests. And he says, I'm starving, I'm on the run, and the priest is like, where are your men? Like, he recognizes it's David. He's like, where is everybody? Why are you alone? And David's like, the king sent me on a very special assignment. More like he's trying to kill you. So he said, could you just give me some food? And so the priest gives him food and gives him the Goliath's sword. This is 1 Samuel, I think, 21 and 22. I'm kind of summarizing right now to get us to 23. Saul chases David around. David ends up in Philistia. He's in the Philistine territory. They figure out he's David. Turns out they don't like David in Philistia because he killed Goliath and killed tens of thousands of their men. So David pretends he's insane in front of the king at Gath, one of the provinces of Philistine territory. And he's scratching at the doorposts, and he's drooling down his beard, and he's got saliva coming out of orifices, and stuff's happening. And the king's like, why did you bring this crazy person? He dismisses him. So now David ends up in a cave in Adullam. And it's kind of funny language. I'll give you this one right out of the Word, right out of the Scriptures. David left Gath, that's the Philistine province that he pretended he was crazy, escaped to the cave in Adullam. When his brothers and his father's household heard about it, they went down to him there. All those who were in distress or in debt or discontented gathered around him, and he became their leader. About 400 men were with him. So David went from being one of the top dogs in Israel with tons, like legions of soldiers and kingly authority and all this backing and resource. So now he's in a cave, and the ones that are following him are essentially like the broken, the downtrodden, the outlaws, the ones that have no place in society and are down on their luck. And this whole moment is this like Christ-like. There's a lot of parallels with Jesus and David, but this is like a Jesus-David parallel big time, where David went, you'd think, hey, here's the future king of Israel, a shepherd turned king. Did you see all the symbolism here? David, instead of having armies of trained militant people at his beck and call, he's got the downtrodden, he's got the ignorant fishermen, he's got the uneducated dropouts. This is where David is. So now let's go into 1 Samuel 23, and we're going to see how David heard the voice of God and learn a few things from him. So 1 Samuel 23, verse 1. When David was told, look, the Philistines are fighting against Keilah and are looting their threshing floors. So threshing floors, if you're not familiar with that terminology, that's where they would separate the grain from the straw, the grain from the wheat. This is the place where essentially the harvest was made usable. And this Keilah is a city, a town, that was in the outskirts of Judah. And it was right on the border of Philistia, where the Philistines, the armies, would encamp. And so this kind of off the beaten path Israeli town is being taken advantage of just by geographical liability and vulnerability. The Philistine armies were just stealing their grain, stealing their harvest. And so when David hears about this, this is what he said. This is what he does. He inquired of the Lord, saying, "Shall I go and attack these Philistines?" And now, part of the reason why I gave you all this context is maybe for a minute, if you read this without knowing that, you would be thinking to yourself, this is not a hard question. This isn't really a big act of discernment on David's part. This is David who killed Goliath. This is David who slaughtered tens of thousands of Philistines. This is David with the armies of Israel and the backing of the king. No, this is David with a few hundred men who just were living in a cave, on the run, and there's thousands of people trying to kill them all. And he's not with trained military people. He's with the outcasts and the downtrodden. And now David, he's not looking for trouble. David's looking for survival. And a situation is brought before David by and by. Hear this. The situation was brought to David. And David's response wasn't, too bad, so sad, I'm trying to survive here. David's response wasn't, I killed Goliath, I can do anything. David's response was actually more humble than either one of those maybe extremes. Instead, he's like, okay, this is not my ideal circumstance for so many reasons. And though I've had many successes against the Philistines in the past, I'm not really in the same position I was when I had those. What should I do? And his thought process turns immediately to the Lord. So maybe you find yourself in a situation where it's not ideal. Logic and reason would tell you it'd be easier to skip over this situation. Maybe that person asks you for money, and you're like, well, I mean, I probably could do something, but what will that? How will that affect me? How will it affect those around me, my family? I'm giving you a money situation, but it could be anything. Stopping on the side of the road to help someone. It could be any situation that you find yourself in where inconvenience and logic and reason can quickly dissuade you. And I'm not saying it should or shouldn't, but David's posture is, I don't want those things to define what I do. I don't want those things to dictate what I do. I don't want my circumstance to dictate what I do. I want the voice of the Lord to dictate what I do. So David asked the Lord, should I go and attack these Philistines? The Lord answered him, go attack the Philistines and save Keilah. But David's men, remember these are not military people, David's men said to him, here in Judah we're afraid. Like we're like relatively safe from the Philistines right now. We're on the run from Saul, we're on the outskirts, but we're relatively safe, compared to taking an army head on. Here in Judah we're afraid. How much more then if we go to Keilah against the Philistine forces? Now watch what David does here. This is beautiful. This is necessary. This is part of the process. If you miss this, you're going to get it wrong some of the time, guaranteed. Ask me how I know. Once again, David inquired of the Lord. Once again, David inquired of the Lord. And the Lord answered him, go down to Keilah, for I am going to give, in fact, let me read it more gently, because that's probably not fair. Go down to Keilah, for I'm going to give the Philistines into your hand. Go down to Keilah, for I'm going to give the Philistines into your hand. So what just happened? David's presented with a situation. It's not at all convenient for him to do anything about it. He asks God anyways, and God says, yeah, go and take care of this thing. David tells the other people that this will affect. Because by the way, sometimes when you hear God's voice, it doesn't just affect you. The decision, especially if you're in a leadership role of any kind. Your decision, based off of what you think God is saying, oftentimes ripples and affects those around you, especially if you're a leader. David's men question. They don't say, David, you're crazy, or David, no way, Jose, we're not going to do this. But they do say, hey, we're not exactly happy about our situation. Like, we're kind of afraid of where we are right now. Now you want to take us and intentionally put us in enemy territory and take them head on. And this is like, whatever, I'm going to do it. This is like 300, like that movie where 300 Spartans kill however many Persians. Like, it's like that scenario where a much greater army, much greater military force is up against a bunch of untrained, and the Spartans were crazy, actually. Anyways. This is a moment where it's David and Goliath again. A military force that's far greater is up against a few hundred men that were in a cave being trained by David for like maybe days or weeks, not any length of time. And so his men are like, I don't know if we should do this. This is not a good idea. This gives me a not good feeling in my stomach. So what does David do? He doesn't rebuke his men. He doesn't correct his men. He doesn't withdraw either. He goes back to the Lord and asks the same exact question again. And he gets the same exact answer again, but perhaps that even stronger. Like, I'm going to deliver. Before you asked, should I go and do this? And he said, yes, you should go and do this. This time, the Lord says, I'm going to deliver the Philistines into your hands. Like, you're going to win this thing, and you got my backing. You've got my promise. You've got my stamp on this thing. So then they go and do it. So David and his men went to Keilah, fought the Philistines, and carried off their livestock. He inflicted heavy losses on the Philistines and saved the people of Keilah. So what's the takeaway there? Number one, sometimes, even when it's inconvenient, you should be, in fact, I'll say it this way, all the time, even when convenience is a factor, comfort is a factor, when circumstances pop up and you're like, here's the situation, the right answer is, what's God saying? And don't let convenience or comfort or logic or reason be the dictator. Let the voice of the Lord be that dictator. Let him define your path. Number two, the bigger the decision, and perhaps the greater the ripple it will have on those around you. And especially if that ripple, the immediate effect is, are you sure we should do this? This seems like a bad idea. Don't just go on the laurels of, well, I'm pretty sure I heard what God said that first time, that one time. Go back to the Lord and hear him again freshly. Make sure that you heard what you thought you were hearing. Maybe you heard something, but you didn't get it quite right. Or maybe there was more for him to say, and you only got part one, and you need part two. In this case, David was spot on. But it was good for his men, and it was good for David as a leader to know that me going back to the Lord is actually best practice. It's the best foot forward. It's the best thing to do. So anyways, the bigger the decision, the bigger the ripple, the more confirmation you want in God's voice. Does that make sense? Now, Abiathar, son of Ahimelech, had brought the ephod down with him when he fled to David at Keilah. So what I didn't tell you before is, remember that priest, that town of priests in the middle of nowhere? It was this place called Nob. In Nob, the priest helps David. When Saul finds out that the priest helped David, what does Saul do? He tells his men, go and get those priests. Get the whole, Ahimelech is the guy that was just referenced. Ahimelech is the name of the priest that helped David. Get Ahimelech here. In fact, bring his whole family, and let's find out what really happened. So Saul interrogates him very, very aggressively. Finds out that Ahimelech, in fact, did help David, but with no malintent, but still helped him. So Saul's order is, kill Ahimelech, the priest, and his whole family, and his whole town. And his men are like, no, I'm not going to do that. Why? Because to kill a bunch of priests for no reason seemed like a bad idea to his men. But there's this one guy that was working for Saul who said, I'll do it. And so he kills the whole town. He kills 85 priests, then women and children, babies even, it says. Just raises the whole village, kills their livestock, everything. Wipes them out. This guy, Abiathar, is the only family member who survived that slaughter and escaped, fled to David, and told David what Saul did. So this guy's also on the run and has suffered greatly. Abiathar, son of Ahimelech, had brought the ephod down with him when he fled to David at Keilah. What's with the ephod? Now, I didn't really know this until somewhat recently. I think I've bumped into it a couple times and kind of forgotten about it. So the ephod was something that priests would wear. That's how it started off, at least. It's almost like a priestly garment or apron that they'd put over, and when they were sacrificing and worshiping and doing things, this apron kind of covered part of their torso. Well, it evolved, and over time, the ephod wasn't necessarily worn all the time. It was more an article used in priestly duties. And we don't actually know exactly how it was structured, but they were essentially using this ephod as like a form of casting lots. And what they were doing is essentially, again, they didn't have the Holy Spirit. They didn't have the Holy Spirit like you do. So when they had a question for God, they were kind of doing this like God-sanctioned Old Testament magic 8-ball thing with an ephod. And they'd ask a question, and they'd whether it was rolling a die or somehow twirling something around and it would spin, or we don't know. But they were doing something with this ephod to try to get answers from the Lord. And this priest brought his ephod, and David knows it now. So keep reading. Saul was told that David had gone to Keilah, and he said, God has handed him over to me, for God has imprisoned himself by entering a town with gates and bars. Saul called up his forces for battle to go down to Keilah to besiege David and his men. And we'll back up for 1 second because I want you to hear this. Saul was told that David had gone to Keilah, and he said, who said? Saul said to himself, God has handed him over to me, for David has imprisoned himself by entering a town with gates and bars. This is another key point. If you've been tuning out because I talked about an ephod too long, jump back on with me for a second. What is Saul doing right now? The opposite of David. So David is presented with a situation, and though convenience and logic and reason could make him automatically choose one way, I'm not going to Keilah. In fact, my men aren't even for me if I do this. I'm not going to Keilah. There's no logic, no reason, no convenience, no comfort in that. It must not be God's will. That would be that's not what David did. That's the Saul. So what is Saul doing? Saul is looking at circumstance and discerning circumstance, not God's voice, and saying, oh, and this is what we do in Christian circles. It's an open door. God must have opened that door. It's a closed door. God must have closed that door. And I'm not saying there aren't moments where that's true and that doesn't actually happen, and God can open and close doors. Don't hear what I'm not saying. But man, if that's your process of discernment is whether or not the door is open, I don't know how you're still alive. I mean, it's an open door. I can go 100 miles per hour on River Road. Maybe, not in the Honda. It's an open door. That money is right in the cash register. Like, it's so it's like I'm making a joke of how crazy it is, but like, zoom into a more practical version of this. What's Saul saying? Wow, David ended up in this walled city in the middle of nowhere, and there's really not that many exits from that city. If I reach him while he's in the city, he's done. There's no way he'll escape. I have a whole army. He's got a few hundred men at best. So Saul's logic is, God must be handing David over to me. And he's just doing that just by looking at the circumstance, the situation. And he's assuming God's will based off of circumstance, based off of situation. And he's wrong. David looks at circumstance and situation and says, yeah, logic and reason is fine, but God's voice is better. What is he saying? So I'm not going to read it because I want to keep moving. But you can imagine what happens next. Saul heads over to Keilah with 3,000 men, and David hears that Saul's coming. David doesn't even choose to run immediately. Watch what he does. First, he asks God a question, and they have the ephod, so they're using the ephod now. He says, is Saul really going to come here and try to kill me? And twofold question. And will the people of Keilah hand me over to him? And so God gives him an answer to his one question. He says, he will. Which question did he answer? Well, the Saul question. Yes, Saul will come to Keilah and try to kill you. And so then David only heard one answer, though he had two questions. So what does David do? He goes and he asks God the question again. He says, but will the people of Keilah hand me over to him? And then God responds, and David hears, and he says, yes, they will. They will hand you over to Saul. So what ends up happening? David wants the full answer from God, and he asks the full question, but step one, he only gets part of the answer. He clearly hears that Saul's coming to kill him in Keilah. He does not clearly hear an answer regarding whether or not the people of Keilah are going to give him up. So he asks again until he does get that clarity. And then once he finally gets that full picture, like, yes, Saul's coming, yes, the people of Keilah, who you just saved, are going to betray you, now he chooses to leave. God basically gives him that instruction. So do you see how David was operating? Now, next chapter, and again, we won't read any of this because I want to wrap up. Next chapter, David is now in a totally different region. He's relocated. Saul knew where he was, so he moves to a new place. David and his men are now in a cave again, different cave, different region. Saul hears about David and his men in this new region and immediately mobilizes his forces and tries to capture him. On the way, and this is Bible, so you can't be mad at me, on the way, Saul has to go number 2. So this is what happens. Saul has to go number 2. So he finds a cave, because why would you go number 2 anywhere else if you have a perfectly good cave? He goes into a cave to relieve himself, and it turns out to be the exact cave that David and his men are camped in. So now Saul is completely alone, because nobody follows you while you go number 2, hopefully, unless you have small children like I do. Nobody follows, and that's, yeah, whatever. I've given you enough. Now you're listening. What about all the spiritual revelation I've been imparting? Okay, so Saul is completely isolated, alone, vulnerable. His men are not with him, and he's obviously preoccupied with what he's doing. So when David's men realize what's happening, like, Saul is in this cave by himself right now, the very cave that we're in with, there's a bunch of us here. They say to David, they're like, this is the day that God is saying that he's handing Saul over to you to do whatever you want. You get to choose, David. This is what God is saying. And it's super interesting. So what does David have? The biggest open door of his life. This is like the person who is in the way of my ultimate calling, and oh, by the way, is trying to kill me. I have him completely vulnerable and could easily kill him. I've got hundreds of men if I could call upon them. They'd be done in 2 seconds. So what does David do? He goes up to Saul while he's going number 2, and he cuts the corner of his robe off of Saul's robe, takes it, and leaves. And then the language is really interesting. It doesn't necessarily say outwardly that that David heard God's voice, but it does say that as he's walking away with the cut cloth from Saul's robe, it says that his heart struck him. What's David known for? Being a man after God's own heart. So something in David's heart started to stir. And he's walking away, and he goes back to his men with the cloth from Saul's robe, and he rebukes his men. And he says, surely not. Who am I to slay the anointed of the Lord? Who am I to kill God's king? Who am I to take this matter into my own hands? I'm going to have no part in this. And he rebuked his men and said, you're not going to touch him either. So Saul leaves, completely unknowing that he was in the greatest danger of his life, potentially. And then, by and by, David points this whole scenario out to him as proof positive that David was never out to kill Saul anyways. And that's kind of how the story ends. So where do we land with all of this? Open doors, closed doors, logic and reason in your situation, they're not God's voice. They're not. And if you're just using those things as your test of what God is saying or doing or wants to do, that's what King Saul was doing and failing over and over again. David would look at the circumstance, and sometimes it would be extremely favorable, and yet he wouldn't assume that he was supposed to take the easy, favorable thing. Sometimes they'd be extremely unfavorable and inconvenient, yet he wouldn't assume that therefore he needs to avoid that situation. Every time he was looking for God's purpose, every time he was trying to freshly hear what God's voice, if he only got part of an answer, what would he do? He'd go back and get the full answer. If he got an answer, but he realized, wait a minute, this is affecting other people, or this is a big decision that's going to ripple, he'd go back and double check, double hear God's voice on the same matter, make sure he heard correctly, make sure he didn't miss it. What are you to do? What am I to do? The same exact thing. David was the man after God's own heart. He had part of this process cracked, and he was living by this, especially through this season, beautifully. All right, so we're going to close out. Do you want to close? Go for it. Somebody pointed out that we're both wearing denim short sleeve things, so here you go.
I got the memo. This has been an interesting series because, Tim was talking about the whisper a couple weeks ago, and this has been a reality in my life. When we read the story in the Scripture, we think, well, David inquired of the Lord, and the Lord said, yes, go down and smite them, and it's like, have you had your coffee this morning? It wasn't like that. I mean, it was like his inquiry of the Lord was probably more like meditating, like, Lord, I just need some direction here. And he would get the internal green light, red light, caution light. And, when we had the opportunity to adopt Shane, we didn't have time to pray that through. We had minutes, and we made a decision because living a life of prayer, you have those opportunities. And so it was the whisper. Was this the time? Was this the thing? Is this a good thing? Is it a go? Yeah, it was a go. We've never regretted it. And, there's been many times over my career in the military and as a federal employee where I've had to remake myself, make really life-changing, career-changing decisions. And the Lord would work in this by first beginning to change my heart towards something. I've never heard an audible voice from God, but I have heard the voice of God for many, many years. And it's not an audible voice, it's an internal voice. And a lot of times it'll come to you through a thought that didn't originate from you. Sometimes it'll come through a conversation with somebody that something awakens in you. And so when I was in the Air Force and I knew I had re-enlisted, I'd been in a long time, I was loving the military, it was time to change. I didn't know it was time to change, but after I re-enlisted, I sensed in my spirit, that's the last time you're doing that. I was like, that's weird because I love the Air Force. Well, the change slowly worked into me, and when it came time to get out, I got out. A year later, I went on staff at our church in Florida as a minister and went into full-time ministry. There was a time that was time to change. It was never an external audible voice, but it was always this whisper, this sensing, this knowing internally. And just like it was with Shane, when I left my job with the U.S. Treasury Department in 2019, I was at the top of my earnings in my whole life. I loved my job. There was no reason whatsoever. I was highly respected and honored in my position. My executives loved me. As a matter of fact, they made an exception to policy to keep me so I could come up here and work from home, much of my schedule remotely. But there came a time when I knew it was time to make a shift. And how did I know? It was an internal whisper that took time and working. And I was never running from something. I was running to something. And had that not happened, we may not have Shane. We may not be here. I don't know. But so just understand, it's never this, hey, Tim, take this right turn. It's never like that. It's like, a nudge, an internal nudge. And so anyhow, so that was great. It's a great series, great message. And so I hope that you kind of get where we're coming from on that, this whisper. It really is a whisper. It's always very gentle. It's very quiet.